This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and this interview is being recorded on the premises of the annual conference of the Association for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. My guest today is a world-renowned professor of American Jewish history. She works at New York University, and she's also the author of numerous books, most recently Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migration to the New World, and The Peddlers Who Forged the Way. It was recently published by Yale University Press. Professor Hasia Diner, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
In what ways were the migration patterns of Jews to the New World different from those of non-Jews?
All people were migrating. I mean, this was the great age of migration, and Jews were hardly out on the road alone, both literally and figuratively. And this is the period of mass emigration from Europe and from the Middle East, and indeed all over the world. Most migrations were, in fact, short distance. That is, people left rural areas, went to the larger cities in their regions, but there was vast transoceanic migration, and Jews were ultimately a very small part of that migration. So just as an example, in this century, which we often refer to as the long 19th century, between the 1820s and the 1920s, about 65 million Europeans came to America. Okay, of them, 4 million were Jews. So Jews were not very different at all. And all peoples migrated in family units or as single individuals responding to economic and family pressures in the places where they originated. Most migrations were economic in nature, and even Jewish migrations, because there are many people who would have answered your question and said, oh, the Jewish migration was different because Jews were fleeing persecution and religious intolerance.
No, but I mean in terms of patterns, where did they go and why?
Yeah, so again, for most Europeans, the place they really wanted to go was the United States. And so Jews were probably more single-mindedly America-oriented, but not radically more. So since we have time, I gather, for this, say, for example, Italians who are also migrating in an enormous number. There you have a migration which half of the Italians, particularly the southern Italians who left, went to South America, and the other half to the United States. The Irish, who again, I mean, even larger percentage of the Irish population left, and they went to various parts of the British Empire, Australia, and the other parts of the British Isles in very large number, although a significant number to the United States. If we want to talk about what was notable about Jewish patterns, was how single-mindedly it was focused on the United States.
Why is that?
Well, I'd say of the places in the world that were available, and there were lots of places that were available, it offered the greatest bundle of economic opportunities, political freedoms. They came to the United States with probably the most important privilege that any immigrant could have, which is they were white. And in a sense, once the migration began to form and Jewish enclaves are formed in the United States, then it generated further Jewish migration. So Jews went to the places where there were other Jews, and they went there not just because they wanted the familiarity, but also because, and here we in a way have the hook to the peddlers, that it became a way of accessing communal credit networks. And so that Jews coming to a particular city or town in the United States turned to the local Jewish population for credit, which was necessary to go out and start selling their stuff. This migration, the only other group of immigrants for whom peddling was the most important first footstep were Arabs. So that is Arabs from what we now would call Syria and Lebanon, initially Christian, although not exclusively. But like Jews, their access to the United States, the draw was the ability to use communal networks of credit to go out and pursue this basically odd occupation. Okay, and just to say something about percentage, of the Jews who, in this long 19th century, who crossed some national border to relocate from the place they started to someplace new, but crossed national border, 85 to 90% came to the United States. Okay, and
quite remarkable.
Yeah, and the 10 to 15% who didn't probably wanted to, but
got stuck in the way.
Got stuck in the way, personal or family circumstances. They had an uncle already in Cuba, or there was a townsperson already in South Africa. But 85 to 90% of the United States, and many of those who went to places like England and France and Germany saw those as basically points of transit because the goal was to get to the United States.
Yeah. And how did these networks spread? Was it really across the country or in specific places? How did they evolve?
Yes. So the networks, on the one hand, they're generated from within family and community groupings. And
so the communities in the old world were pretty much replicated to the new world?
Yes, although they always scatter, but so people from a particular town in Lithuania, some of them go to Syracuse, New York.
Right.
Okay, well, once they're there, it becomes a beachhead for the next set of young people and so on, who then will go out from there so that they follow very clearly articulated patterns or lines that are based on familiarity and based on family, partly because family members who are already in the United States sent money back home in the form of remittances, and much of that money came, I mean, some of it was like real money, but some of it was tickets, ship's tickets, and promises, vague or otherwise, of I'll get you started when you get here.
So why do you think then it was so predominant among the Jews as opposed to the others? What was it, because they came with strong community bonds already?
Well, this is true of all immigrants.
Yeah.
I mean, that is, you could take a town, let's say like Johnstown, Pennsylvania. You can see that all the Poles, and all the Hungarians in Johnstown came from the same four villages in Poland and Hungary. And I wouldn't say the Jews had a stronger communal network at all. And indeed, one historian who's worked on Sicilians living in New York has actually found apartment buildings, in Little Italy, that were village specific.
Right.
Okay, and that, people in one apartment building on Elizabeth Street all came from the same town. Okay, and so this.
But still, the credit community.
Oh, so the credit is very important. So here, I think we have a couple of really important factors. So for one thing, the idea of migrating through the aegis of entrepreneurship, economic entrepreneurship, selling stuff, was the Jewish niche for centuries. So that Jews, the question is is this a skill or not? Because most Jewish communal elites and most historians consider this to be unskilled work. Although I always say, let them try doing it for a day and they'll find how much skill it took. But it was the understanding that this is a way you make a living. And so that for many other immigrants from many other places who had been agricultural laborers, and who'd been farmers, peasants, working somebody else's land, there was no transfer of knowledge. That is, they didn't know. That was not something one did. And then for Jews, because of the nature of the patterns of migration, those who were there first and did well or somewhat well both provided the credit for the next one to come, but also needed the next one. So, I mean, a very typical pattern is, and one older figure in American Jewish history says nobody knows who the first one was.
Yeah.
And so it's almost not worth asking, who's the first Jew in this place or that place, because we don't know. But those who were there first begin as peddlers, and it was a short-term occupation. It was not a life sentence, but do it for 2 years, 3 years, whatever. And as the territory they covered got larger, it was in their interest to have their brother come, and they could cover together a larger territory, and then maybe another brother, and cover an even larger territory.
And is this what accounts for the spread of the Jewish populations across the United States today?
Absolutely. And well, if not for today I think we have other kinds of patterns, the opening up of regions for professional opportunity. But there have been some really interesting studies of, for example, places like Arkansas, which we don't think of as a Jewish setting, but there had been hundreds of Jewish peddlers in Arkansas in the 1870s, 1880s, and then as one after the other earned enough to get off the road and open a shop, they clustered in particular towns, and they'd build a congregation, they'd have create a cemetery, they'd create other kinds of institutions, maybe a B'nai B'rith lodge, and there'd be a kind of hub of Jewish life in a place, let's say like Helena, Arkansas. And it usually had, in those small towns, about a 2-generation life, because their children had no interest in going out on the road. The children receive an American-style education, became professionals, and what in the world are you going to do in Helena, Arkansas? But Arkansas is interesting because when Walmart opened its national headquarters or global headquarters in Arkansas, there are now Jews working in the corporate bureaucracy. So these aren't old-time Arkansas Jews. They're young people, or maybe not young, but people, Jews who lived in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, whatever, who see, Walmart is looking for 25 computer program, people or accountants or whatever. And once, that business starts flourishing in the contemporary period in a place like Fayetteville, Arkansas, then there's need for doctor's offices and dentists. And so in each era of American Jewish history, population flows are based on what had been, but also what are the new economic opportunities. Again, as another example, during World War II, a lot of American Army bases were situated in the South. That's where land was cheap, and so there are a lot of Army bases and a lot of Jewish guys who served in the military and who were stationed at Fort Bliss or Fort Hood. So, maybe I should stay here and open a business here, or I'm an accountant. There's no accountant in this town, and so that in a way that's an economic opportunity. It's not peddling, and it's a 20th century opportunity. The peddling opportunity was a long 19th century one, but whatever migrations, both global and internal, were shaped by understanding economic opportunity and using both skills, knowledge, and communal resources to follow opportunities where they beckoned.
I want to go back to the peddlers.
Sure. Yes, yeah.
And ask you, how did their prevalence among the Jews affect family life? I mean, because there were men who went on the road, probably not seeing their families for weeks and months. How did it affect family life and community life?
Okay, so that's, again, a great question. And so on the one hand, most Jewish peddling in the United States, and indeed in the New World, tended to work on a weekly cycle rather than a monthly, which was more common in Europe, where Jewish peddlers would be out on the road and only come back at holidays, for example.
Right.
But in the New World setting, and in America is just the most important, they had weekly routes. And so they'd go out on the road on Sunday and they'd sell Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Friday, they'd come back to whatever was the sort of village or town or city that was, let's call it, the hub of Jewish life. And they would be there Friday night, Saturday, and then Saturday night, they would basically go back to their creditors. We haven't yet talked to them, and pay back. Because they had, they were working, in a sense, they're working for the creditor. They pay back, okay, this is what I've earned. This is how much is my profit, because the peddlers made a profit off this. They would often bank their money with their own wholesaler, with the person who gave them the money. And then they'd fill up their bags to get ready to go back out on the road the next day. So this weekly cycle. And so in Ireland, where probably, close to every Jewish man, they all came from 4 or 5 different little towns in Lithuania, in the province of Kovno. They were all peddlers, and they were known as weekly men. And so the housewives in the countryside didn't call them peddlers or hawkers, but they called them the weekly man. So that gives you an idea of it. So which goes back to the question of family life. So among some of these peddlers, and it's the numbers are elusive, they were just unmarried men. Okay, and one reason they migrated in the first place was because staying home, be it Lithuania or Bavaria, they just couldn't get married. They didn't have the economic resources. So this is the way to, in essence, provide themselves with the economic basis to get married, have a family, get started in life. And so once they had amassed enough money to be able to get off the road is when they got married. And they relied on community networks. Somebody had a sister, or I saw a number of cases where men would actually go back, particularly from places in Central Europe, like in Bohemia, Bavaria. They'd go back to their hometown, and they'd obviously get to show off how well they had done. And then they'd find a bride. And sometimes they would actually find a bunch of other young unmarried Jewish women and bring them back. Okay, by the way, no immigration laws that make this hard. No visas, no anything, and no passports. And because these men knew dozens of Jewish bachelors, all of whom wanted to get married. Okay, some of the peddlers, particularly the ones coming later, like the 1870s, 1880s, from places like Lithuania, were married men. And they had kind of a number of different patterns. Some of them left their wives and children back home. And they had their peddling years. And then once they again amassed enough savings, they'd then send for wives and children. Others actually brought their wives with them to the New World, and they left the wives and children in some large city where there's a Jewish community and where there's relatives. And the men would be off on that weekly cycle, and they'd come back then on the weekend. Certainly for that first group, the single men, lots and lots of stories, and we can't even begin to quantify them. It's just totally not quantifiable.
What I don't understand is if there were so many Jewish peddlers coming to the New World, and they in turn determined the settlement patterns of Jews in America, how did the Jews become such an urban population?
Right.
Where was the turning point? I mean, how did they concentrate in New York and other big cities?
Right. So for one thing, a lot of the peddlers are peddling out of New York. I mean, that's their base, or Chicago, Cincinnati, Baltimore. These were huge peddler bases. And
but by then they could have used trains, right?
They used trains, or they would go out on canal boats, horse and wagon. The person who gave them their goods, the wholesaler, also gave them a route. And they always called it their Medina. And they never competed with each other. Okay, so if a particular shopkeeper is also outfitting peddlers, he might have 5 peddlers who works for him. You have one route, you have another route, and he would never give credit to somebody who ever encroached on somebody else's route.
Right,
so,
okay.
Really important. So somebody could be based in Baltimore. Sunday they might get on a boat on a canal with their wagon, and it would take them 50 miles, and then they'd start peddling, and then Friday afternoon, take the boat back to Baltimore. Others were based in small towns, but once they had gotten enough resources, would then move to the big cities. But there are Jewish small towns and Jewish medium-sized towns all over the country, and particularly until about the 1920s, there are these communities all over the place, in the South, in the far West, and in the Midwest, and sometimes these places where they were then themselves grew into big cities. So the first Jews who come to Chicago, we think, well, Chicago, the second city, huge. It didn't start out as a big city. It started out as a couple buildings on the prairie with no paving. But they're Jews there right away when the city is. And again, this frontier town is taking its first outline, first being outlined, and they're Jewish peddlers peddling from Chicago. And so in those kinds of places, it's also very interesting, I think, that these Jewish peddlers are, in a sense, among the first families in the town. They're not latecomers. Okay, but they can say, look, we were here from the beginning.
So wherever there are Americans, there are Jewish peddlers.
Absolutely,
in a sense.
Absolutely. And I found when I was doing the research, whenever we went on a vacation, any place, I would ask for, from my family, can I have a couple hours? Let me go to the local historical society. And I just promised I'm only going to be 5 hours. You all do whatever you want to do. And I always found them. Small towns in upstate New York and Vermont and Maine, and sort of in really strange kinds of archives, they would pop up. And there was a credit rating agency called R.G. Dunn, which eventually becomes Dun & Bradstreet, and they rate companies as to their credit worthiness. And the books of R.G. Dunn are Baker Library at Harvard. And so you can look, they go back to the 1830s, 40s, and you can look every place you go, they have little handwritten notes about a Jewish peddler.
Right.
And what their customers said about them. Likewise, there were some. And we had, again, the numbers, who knows, of cases where they were murdered. Somebody attacked them because they not because they're Jews, but because they're men on the road with money and with goods. And so then there'd be, the police or the sheriff, the local law authority would try to find who killed them and be tried. So again, these come from all over the country. Alabama, Georgia, upstate New York.
And it lasted until the 1920s because of the restriction of the immigration laws. That's what really killed them off?
Well, that killed them off, but also the automobile, rural, the delivery of goods to rural areas, roads. I mean, just a lot of these places didn't have paved roads. The deep hinterlands didn't have paved roads. The mail order catalogs. Okay, which founded by a number of very important Jewish figures who started these mail order catalogs and made the roads, the cars, and so on. They made it easier for farm families to drive into town, go shop in the store. Although I've been told, and it will be a project for someone else, I didn't do it, but that a not insignificant number of German Jewish refugees in the 1930s. When they come, they get their first steps peddling in the really remote areas, both on the mainland United States as well as in parts of Central America. And in fact, when I was working on this, a cousin of mine, I was telling her I was doing this, and she said, well, didn't you know my father, when he came from Poland in the 1930s, started out selling ties, suspenders, men's handkerchiefs as a peddler in Cuba. And again, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, he made enough money that he didn't have to, I mean, it's terrible work. Who would want to do it? But so it had a life beyond my period, but I just didn't do that.
Yeah. I wanted to know, and we'll have to wrap up soon, so that's probably my last question. Did the legacy of the Jewish peddlers, does it still exist in the American Jewish folklore today? I mean, 20th century, 21st century. Is it something that American Jews today look back on with some sort of nostalgia?
With nostalgia, yes. And it's actually very interesting because I've had many opportunities to give public lectures on this. And I always begin by asking how many people in the audience had a grandfather or uncle who was a peddler, and anybody over a certain age, their hand goes up, and they have great stories. Sometimes people have brought me, when they heard that there was going to be a lecture on peddlers, they brought me artifacts, their grandfather's peddler's license. Somebody gave me a handwritten diary. So yes, I mean, it is kind of out there as part of the legacy of getting started, and it fits the Jewish narrative, whether accurate or not, of we came poor, we made it. And in a way, it's all about our own strength and our own skills, kind of forgetting the fact that because they were white people, they could be out on the road, and they knew the state, even though they were new immigrants, the government would protect them, and that they were playing into, well, yes, they had their skills, but they're also playing into Americans' desire for material goods. And the reason America, the United States, was so attractive is because here is a nation of people whose greatest happiness comes from buying things.
Yeah. Well, that's the way to make it, right? Professor Hasia Diner, a professor of American Jewish history at New York University and the author of Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migration to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. Thank you very much for giving us this interview.
My pleasure.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberger, sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast and many more where it came from, just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Dalia Shandlin will be back with us shortly, but until then, visit our website, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.